It was an unusually warm afternoon in Westwood Heights, a quiet, well-manicured suburban neighborhood where everything seemed in its right place. The lawns were trimmed to perfection, the driveways spotless, and the smell of freshly cut grass filled the air. Jerome Harris, in his mid-30s, stood outside one of the houses, kneeling by a row of bushes, focused on his work. Dressed in work clothes, with his cap slightly tilted to block the sun, he hummed softly to himself as he clipped away at the hedges. Jerome loved his job. There was something about taking care of a garden, watching it grow and thrive, that gave him peace. His clients loved him too, for his precision and care. But today, things felt different. Across the street, Marge Wilson, a woman in her late 50s, stood behind her living room window, watching Jerome through narrowed eyes. She was one of those longtime residents who took it upon herself to keep an eye on things. In her mind, she was the unofficial neighborhood watch. With her graying blonde hair pulled tightly into a bun and her thin lips pursed, she sipped her coffee, eyes never leaving Jerome. "Who is that?" she muttered to herself. "Haven't seen him around here before." She tapped her fingers against the windowsill, her mind running wild with assumptions. Westwood Heights was a safe place, a neighborhood where nothing out of the ordinary happened. And yet, here was a young black man, working outside, and something about it didn't sit right with her. She glanced at her watch. It was just after 3 p.m. Normally, this was the time when the neighborhood kids came home from school, when the streets filled with families out for walks. Jerome had been working on this particular lawn for months, but today, for some reason, he stood out to her like never before. Marge's husband, Tom, was in the kitchen, busy flipping through the local newspaper when she called out, "Hey Tom, come take a look at this." He barely lifted his head from the sports section. "What now, Marge?" "Just come over here and look," she insisted, a hint of urgency creeping into her voice. With a sigh, Tom got up and wandered over to the window. He looked out, squinting in the sunlight. "What, Jerome? He's been working here for months. What's the big deal?" Marge frowned. "I don't know, something's off. Should he even be here? I mean, do we really know him?" Tom raised an eyebrow and glanced at his wife. "He's the gardener, Marge. Lisa down the street hired him. Why are you making a fuss?" "I just think it's strange," she said, her voice lowering to a whisper as if Jerome could somehow hear her from across the street. "I mean, look around. He doesn't exactly blend in with the neighborhood, does he?" Tom shook his head and went back to his paper. "You're overreacting. It's just a guy doing his job." But Marge wasn't convinced. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe it was the way he moved, too confident, too at ease, like he didn't belong here. Or maybe it was the fact that he didn't seem concerned about being watched. Marge stepped back from the window, her heart racing slightly. Minutes passed. Jerome kept working, unaware of the storm brewing in Marge's mind. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, stood up, and stretched, looking satisfied with his progress. As he walked back to his truck for more supplies, Marge's anxiety peaked. She felt a wave of unease, a tension building in her chest that she couldn't explain. Her hand trembled slightly as she grabbed her phone from the coffee table. "I'm just looking out for the neighborhood," she told herself, justifying what she was about to do. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she dialed the non-emergency line for the local police. "Police department, what's your emergency?" The dispatcher's voice was calm, routine. Marge took a breath. "I'm calling to report a suspicious person in my neighborhood. There's a man, a black man, and he's been hanging around. I don't know what he's doing, but I don't think he belongs here." The dispatcher asked for more details, and Marge, without hesitation, provided Jerome's description. As she hung up the phone, a knot of guilt formed in her stomach, but she pushed it down. This was about safety, she told herself. She was doing the right thing. Or was she? Outside, Jerome continued working, blissfully unaware of the storm coming his way. Jerome wiped the sweat from his brow, taking a moment to admire his work. The garden was coming along nicely, and he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The flowers were vibrant, the hedges neatly trimmed, and the lawn looked pristine. It was a perfect, peaceful day, until he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. 2 police cars, lights flashing, slowly rolled down the street, stopping just a few houses away. Jerome glanced around, confused. They couldn't be here for him, could they? He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just working. As the cars came to a halt, 3 officers stepped out. Their faces were stern, and their hands rested near their holsters. Jerome's stomach churned with a sudden unease. He hadn't dealt with the police much in his life, but he knew that things could go wrong fast in situations like this, especially for a black man in a predominantly white neighborhood. His hands, still gripping the hedge clippers, started to shake. "Can I help you, officers?" Jerome asked cautiously, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. The lead officer, Officer Daniels, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a square jaw, approached first. His eyes darted to Jerome's tools, then back to his face. "We got a call about a suspicious person in the area," Daniels said, his tone cold and professional. "Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Jerome blinked in disbelief. "Suspicious person? I'm working. I'm the landscaper here." He gestured to the tools scattered around him and the half-finished yard as evidence. Officer Daniels wasn't convinced. His expression remained hard. "Do you have any ID on you? Proof that you're supposed to be here?" Jerome's heart sank. He had dealt with microaggressions before, but nothing like this. His mind raced as he tried to think clearly. The last thing he wanted was to escalate the situation. Slowly, he reached into his pocket to pull out his wallet, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "I work for Lisa Thompson. She's my client. I've been working here for months," he explained, handing over his driver's license. Officer Daniels examined the ID while the other officers, Officer Carter and Officer Barnes, stood back, watching closely. One of them began to circle around Jerome's truck, peering into the windows. Jerome could feel the heat rising in his chest, his pulse quickening. The calm, peaceful day he had been enjoying had taken a sharp turn, and now all he could think about was getting out of this situation safely. As Officer Daniels handed back Jerome's ID, he didn't soften his stance. "We're just responding to a call. Someone thought you didn't belong here." Jerome clenched his jaw, trying to stay composed. He wasn't naive. He knew exactly what this was. Someone had seen a black man in their neighborhood doing his job and assumed the worst. This wasn't about any real suspicion. It was about race. It was about someone deciding that because of the color of his skin, he was a threat. "I'm just doing my job," Jerome repeated, his voice tight with frustration. "I've been working here for months." The officers exchanged glances. Daniels seemed to hesitate for a moment before saying, "We'll need to confirm that. Can you get in touch with the homeowner?" Jerome sighed inwardly, pulling out his phone. He quickly dialed Lisa's number, praying she would pick up. After a few rings, her voice came through the line. "Hey, Jerome, how's everything going with the garden?" Lisa's cheerful tone did little to calm the tension Jerome was feeling. Not great, actually," Jerome said, glancing at the officers. "The police are here. Someone called them on me, saying I'm suspicious or something. They want to confirm I'm working for you." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line before Lisa's voice came back, sharper now. "What? You've got to be kidding me. Stay right there. I'm on my way." Jerome nodded, relieved. "Thanks. I'll wait here." He hung up the phone and looked back at the officers. "Lisa's on her way. She'll clear this up." Officer Daniels gave a curt nod but didn't move. The tension in the air was palpable. Jerome noticed some of the neighbors starting to gather nearby, their eyes wide with curiosity. He could feel their stares, the weight of their judgment. His every move was being watched, scrutinized, as though he had done something wrong just by existing in this space. Minutes dragged by as they waited for Lisa to arrive. Jerome stood awkwardly in the middle of the yard, still holding his clippers. The officers didn't say much, but their presence felt like a looming threat. Jerome's mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if they didn't believe Lisa? What if they decided to arrest him anyway? He tried to focus on keeping his breathing steady, reminding himself that he hadn't done anything wrong. But deep down, he knew that wasn't always enough. Finally, a car pulled up in front of the house, and Lisa stepped out, her face flushed with anger. She marched straight up to the officers, her hands on her hips. "What is going on here?" she demanded, her voice loud enough to turn a few more heads from the gathering neighbors. "This man is my landscaper. He's been working for me for months. Why was this necessary?" Officer Daniels gave a tight-lipped response. "We were just responding to a call, ma'am. Someone reported a suspicious person in the area." "Well, that someone was clearly mistaken," Lisa snapped. "Jerome is not suspicious. He's doing his job." Daniels nodded, though his expression didn't change much. "We just needed to check, ma'am. We'll be on our way." Jerome felt a wave of relief wash over him as the officers finally started to back off, but the humiliation lingered. He could still feel the eyes of the neighbors on him, judging him, as if being black and working in a white neighborhood automatically made him suspicious. The officers didn't apologize, didn't even seem to acknowledge the gravity of the situation. They simply turned and left, as if nothing had happened. As the police cars pulled away, Lisa turned to Jerome, her expression softening. "I'm so sorry, Jerome. I can't believe this happened." Jerome shook his head, his face tight with anger and disappointment. "It's fine," he muttered, though they both knew it wasn't. Lisa opened her mouth to say more, but the damage was done. The neighbors were still standing around, whispering, watching, and Jerome just wanted to get out of there. Without another word, he gathered his tools and started packing them into his truck, feeling the weight of their stares long after the police had gone. As Jerome drove away from the neighborhood, his thoughts raced, replaying the humiliating encounter with the police. The subtle but familiar feeling of anger simmered beneath his calm exterior. He had done everything right, kept his cool, explained his presence, and called the homeowner. Yet, despite all of that, he was still treated as a threat. All because of the color of his skin. The worst part was the casual way the officers had dismissed the situation, as if it were no big deal, just a misunderstanding. He knew better. It wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a symptom of something much deeper. Back in her home, Marge Wilson was still grappling with what had just happened. She sat at her kitchen table, staring blankly at her coffee cup. The sight of the police arriving had given her an odd sense of validation at first, confirmation that she was doing her part to protect the neighborhood. But the way Lisa had stormed out, furious at the officers, and the cold look Jerome had given as he packed up his tools, left Marge with an uneasy feeling in the pit of her stomach. "Maybe I overreacted," she murmured to herself. Tom had told her she was worrying over nothing, but in the moment, she had been sure something was wrong. She wasn't a bad person, she thought. She had just been trying to keep her neighborhood safe. That was all. But why did it now feel like she'd done something terrible? As she sat lost in thought, a notification buzzed on her phone. It was from the neighborhood group chat, a message about the police presence that had caused quite the stir. People were asking questions, speculating about what had happened, and the responses weren't kind. Did anyone else see what went down with the cops earlier? Some guy in a truck was stopped, looked suspicious. Apparently, he's the gardener for Lisa Thompson. Cops got called on him for no reason. Typical racial profiling. That's disgusting. Poor guy. Marge's heart sank. The entire neighborhood was talking about it, and it didn't take long for her to realize that everyone knew she was the one who had called. She started to type out a message to explain herself, but deleted it. What could she say? That she had assumed Jerome was a threat just because he didn't look like he belonged? The more she thought about it, the more guilty she felt. Meanwhile, across town, Jerome pulled up to his modest home, still stewing in frustration. He slammed the door of his truck a little harder than usual and walked inside, tossing his keys onto the counter. His wife, Nina, looked up from the kitchen where she was preparing dinner. She immediately noticed the tension in his shoulders, the tightness in his jaw. "Rough day?" she asked gently. Jerome nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "The cops got called on me while I was working. Can you believe that? I've been doing that job for months, and some lady calls the cops because she thinks I look suspicious." Nina frowned, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "What? That's ridiculous. What happened?" "They showed up, questioned me, made me feel like a criminal right in front of everyone. Lisa had to come and clear things up, but the whole thing was humiliating." Nina came over and put a comforting hand on his arm. "I'm so sorry, Jerome. You didn't deserve that." Jerome sighed, leaning into her touch. "I know, but it's the same thing over and over again. No matter what I do, it's never enough. To some people, I'll always be a threat." Nina shook her head, her voice soft but fierce. You're more than that, Jerome. You've worked hard to get where you are. People like that, they'll never see the real you because they're too blinded by their own ignorance. Jerome appreciated her words, but they didn't fully ease the tightness in his chest. He knew Nina was right, but after years of dealing with the same type of prejudice, it was exhausting. He had grown up in this town, started his landscaping business here, and yet there were still people who treated him like he didn't belong. But there was something else gnawing at him, something Nina didn't know yet. Jerome sat down at the table, running a hand through his hair. There's something else I didn't tell you. Nina sat across from him, concern deepening in her eyes. What is it? Jerome hesitated for a moment before answering. I haven't told anyone yet, but I'm going to be the next mayor. Nina's eyes widened in shock. Wait, what, mayor? When did this happen? They just made the final decision last week. I've been keeping it quiet until the official announcement, but yeah, it's happening. Nina blinked in disbelief, a smile slowly spreading across her face. Jerome, that's amazing! Why didn't you tell me sooner? Jerome shrugged, a wry smile tugging at his lips. I guess I wanted to wait until it was real, but now I'm not so sure. Nina's smile faded slightly. Why? This is a huge opportunity. You've always wanted to make a difference in this town. I have, but after today, I don't know if I'm ready for this. If people are calling the cops on me just for doing my job, what's going to happen when they find out I'm going to be in charge of this city? Nina reached out and took his hand. Jerome, listen to me. You're exactly what this town needs. You've worked hard to get here, and you've earned this. Don't let one person's ignorance make you doubt yourself. Jerome looked down at their hands, feeling a mix of pride and fear. He had spent his whole life working to prove himself, and now he had a chance to make real change. But the events of today had shaken him. If being a black man with a pair of hedge clippers could get the cops called on him, what would happen when he was the mayor? Outside, as dusk settled over the town, Marge continued to scroll through the messages in the neighborhood chat. The more she read, the more her stomach twisted in knots. She had done something wrong, something deeply wrong. But admitting that, facing it, that was something she wasn't sure she was ready for. Yet deep down, she knew this wasn't over. The next morning, Jerome woke up feeling restless. The incident from the previous day still weighed heavily on his mind. He couldn't shake the memory of the police questioning him, treating him like he was guilty of something, and the curious, judgmental eyes of the neighbors watching. He had hoped for a quiet day to collect his thoughts, but as soon as he checked his phone, he realized that wouldn't be possible. His phone was blowing up with notifications. Texts, missed calls, and social media messages all buzzing at once. Jerome furrowed his brow and opened one of the texts from his friend Malik, who lived on the other side of town. Yo, you okay? You're all over the news. Jerome's heart skipped a beat. News? What was going on? He quickly opened his social media accounts, and there it was. Videos, pictures, and posts about the incident with the police. Someone had recorded the entire encounter from their window, and now it was going viral. The caption under one video read, "Racial profiling in Westwood Heights. Police called on Black gardener." Jerome scrolled through the comments, feeling his stomach drop. Typical. Can't even work in peace without someone thinking they're a criminal. This is what racism looks like in America. Sad to see it in my own neighborhood. I can't believe people still think it's okay to call the cops on a black man just for working. It didn't take long before people started tagging him, and that's when Jerome realized the situation was spiraling out of control. His name was attached to the video now, and it was gaining more attention by the minute. News outlets were picking up the story, and it was only a matter of time before everyone knew that he was the man in the video. Nina, standing behind him, placed a hand on his shoulder. Jerome, I think this might be bigger than we thought, she said softly, glancing at the screen. Jerome set the phone down, his head spinning. I didn't want this, Nina. I didn't ask for all this attention. I know, but maybe this is an opportunity, Nina suggested, her voice gentle but firm. Maybe this is your chance to speak up, to stand up for what's right. Jerome let out a heavy sigh. He had never been one to seek out the spotlight, even less so now that his upcoming position as mayor was still a secret. But Nina had a point. This wasn't just about him anymore. The world was watching now, and people were angry, not just for him, but for all the other black men and women who had experienced the same kind of prejudice and racial profiling. Just as he was about to respond, Jerome's phone rang. It was Lisa, the city councilwoman, and his client from the day before. He answered, trying to gather himself. "Hey, Lisa," he said, his voice flat. "Jerome, I just saw the video," Lisa replied, her voice tense. "This is going viral, and the media is already calling me for comments. I think we need to get ahead of this before it spirals out of control." Jerome rubbed his temple. "Yeah, I saw. I don't even know what to say right now. Look, I know you didn't want this, but you're about to be the mayor. This could be your moment to address what's happening not just here, but everywhere. If we handle this right, it could send a powerful message." Jerome paused, taking in her words. He had always wanted to make a difference, to help his community heal and grow, but now that opportunity had arrived in a way he never expected. Was he ready for it? "I don't know, Lisa. I wasn't planning on making an announcement this way." Lisa's tone softened. "I get it, but this is bigger than an announcement. People are talking about this because it's a symptom of something we've been dealing with for far too long. The world is watching, and they're looking to you for leadership." Jerome leaned against the counter, his mind racing. He wasn't sure if he wanted this kind of attention, but deep down, he knew Lisa was right. This was his moment to step up. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all the other people who had been wrongfully judged, who had suffered in silence because of someone else's prejudice. "I'll think about it," he finally said, his voice low. Lisa understood. "Take your time, but don't wait too long. I've already got the city council on alert. They know what's coming, and we want to stand behind you when you're ready." Jerome thanked her and hung up, still feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had been preparing for months to become mayor, but he had never imagined his leadership would begin under such circumstances. Meanwhile, in her home across the neighborhood, Marge Wilson sat at her kitchen table, staring blankly at her phone. She had seen the video too. In fact, it had been forwarded to her by more than one neighbor, each message laced with judgment and disappointment. "How could you do this, Marge? You've really embarrassed yourself and the rest of the neighborhood." Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the flood of comments. People were talking about her too, even if they didn't know her by name. They knew she was the one who had made the call, the one who had sparked the entire ordeal. Shame gnawed at her insides as she realized just how wrong she had been. At first, she had felt justified, like she was protecting her neighborhood. But now, seeing the way people were reacting, hearing the anger and frustration in their voices, she understood that she had done something far more damaging than she had ever intended. The worst part was the growing realization that she had hurt an innocent man. Jerome wasn't just some random worker. He was a respected member of the community. And now, as the video gained more attention, it seemed like everyone was turning against her. Marge sank back in her chair, guilt weighing her down like a heavy stone. She had always thought of herself as a good person, someone who cared about her community, but now she wasn't so sure. In a moment of desperation, she pulled out her phone and began typing a message to the neighborhood group chat. "I'm sorry for what happened yesterday. I didn't mean to cause harm. I was just trying to be cautious. I didn't realize." But as she stared at the words, she realized they felt empty. What could she say that would make this right? How could she apologize for something so deeply rooted in fear and prejudice? With a heavy sigh, she deleted the message and set her phone aside. She wasn't ready to face the consequences of her actions yet, but she knew it was coming, and no amount of apologies could undo the damage she had caused. The community center buzzed with low murmurs and shuffling feet as the residents of Westwood Heights gathered for the emergency town hall meeting. The incident involving Jerome and the police had sparked an outcry, not just within the neighborhood, but throughout the entire city. The local news had run the story for days, and now people wanted answers and change. The auditorium was packed, every seat taken, with people standing along the walls and in the back, eager to hear what Jerome had to say. Jerome sat in the front row, hands resting on his knees, his eyes scanning the crowd. He recognized many faces, some of whom had been his clients over the years. Others were strangers, but all of them wore the same look of anticipation. The past few days had been overwhelming, his phone constantly buzzing with messages of support and the media hungry for an interview. He hadn't spoken publicly yet, but now, sitting in the center of the storm, he knew he had to step up. At the podium stood Lisa, the city councilwoman who had been by his side since the incident. She had organized the meeting to give Jerome the chance to address the community on his own terms, but she knew this was about more than just Jerome's story. It was about the deep-seated issues that had been festering beneath the surface of the town for years. "Thank you all for coming," Lisa began, her voice clear and steady as she addressed the crowd. "We've called this meeting because, as many of you know, something happened in our neighborhood that has sparked a much-needed conversation. This isn't just about one incident. It's about the way we see each other, the way we treat each other, and the changes we need to make as a community." She paused, letting her words sink in, then turned to Jerome. "And now, I'd like to invite Jerome Harris to speak." The crowd shifted as Jerome stood, the tension in the room thickening with expectation. As he made his way to the podium, he could feel hundreds of eyes on him, some sympathetic, others uncertain, and a few cold. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before he began. "Thank you, Lisa," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And thank you to everyone for coming out today. I never thought I'd be standing here, in front of all of you, because of something like this. But here we are." He glanced at the faces in the crowd, his gaze landing briefly on Marge, who sat in the front row, her hands tightly clasped in her lap, her eyes cast down. She hadn't spoken to him since the day she called the police, but Jerome could see the weight of guilt pressing down on her. "I've lived in this town my entire life," Jerome continued, his voice gaining strength. "I've built my business here, worked for many of you, and I've tried to contribute to this community in every way I can. But the truth is, no matter how hard I've worked, no matter how much I've tried to prove myself, there are still people who see me as a threat, just because of the color of my skin." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Jerome paused, letting his words hang in the air. "I'm not here to point fingers or lay blame, but I am here to say that what happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a much bigger problem, one that we can't keep ignoring. Racial profiling, prejudice, fear, it's real, and it's happening right here in our neighborhood." Jerome glanced again at Marge, who remained frozen, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of her seat. "The truth is, I didn't deserve to have the police called on me while I was doing my job. No one does. But I'm not the first person this has happened to, and unfortunately, I won't be the last if we don't do something to change the way we see each other." He could feel the emotion building in his chest, his voice growing heavier with each word. "What happened to me is a reflection of a deeper issue, and I know it's uncomfortable to talk about. I know it's easier to pretend like everything is fine. But we can't move forward until we're honest about the fact that racism, whether it's overt or subtle, still exists in this community." The crowd was silent now, fully captivated by his words. Jerome took another breath, steadying himself. "I'm going to be this city's next mayor, and that means I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that this community becomes a place where everyone feels safe, where everyone feels like they belong. But I can't do it alone. It's going to take all of us. We have to be willing to look at ourselves, to challenge the assumptions we've held for so long, and to make changes, not just in our policies, but in our hearts." Jerome's voice softened as he neared the end of his speech. "I don't want what happened to me to happen to anyone else. I want my daughter to grow up in a town where she's not judged by the color of her skin, but by the content of her character. And I think we can make that happen. I believe we can. But we have to start today." He stepped back from the podium, the silence in the room heavy with thought and reflection. For a moment, no one moved, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a thick fog. Then, slowly, a smattering of applause began from the back of the room, spreading through the crowd until the entire auditorium was clapping. Some stood, others simply nodded in agreement, but the message had been heard. Jerome's heart raced as he sat back down, the tension in his body slowly unwinding. He wasn't sure what would come next, but he knew that something had shifted in the room. Something powerful and necessary. Across the room, Marge sat frozen in her seat, the applause washing over her like a wave of realization. She had been wrong, so deeply, terribly wrong. And now, as she watched Jerome sit back down, his face filled with quiet strength, she felt the full weight of her actions pressing down on her. It was time to make things right. As the applause died down, Marge remained seated, her eyes still fixed on Jerome. The guilt she had been carrying since the incident felt even heavier now, almost unbearable. She knew she had to do something, but the thought of facing Jerome, of admitting her mistake in front of the entire community, terrified her. Still, she couldn't sit idly by anymore. Slowly, she stood up. The room quieted as Marge made her way toward the podium. People turned to look at her, some whispering, others watching with silent curiosity. Jerome, still seated at the front, noticed her movement and met her gaze. His expression was unreadable, but she could sense the tension between them. Marge's heart raced, but she forced herself to take one step at a time, determined to say what she needed to say. When she reached the podium, she stood there for a moment, gripping the sides to steady herself. The crowd was silent now, every eye on her. She cleared her throat, her voice shaking as she began. I'm not really sure how to start this," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I know that I need to apologize." The tension in the room grew as people leaned forward, waiting to hear what she had to say. "I was the one who called the police on Jerome," Marge continued, her voice trembling, "and I did it because I was scared. I let my fear and my prejudice get the best of me. I didn't see a man doing his job. I saw someone who didn't look like he belonged, and that was wrong." Marge paused, her throat tight with emotion. "I've been thinking about it a lot since then, and I realize now that I didn't just hurt Jerome, I hurt this entire community. I acted out of fear, and in doing so, I contributed to the very thing we're all trying to change." She glanced at Jerome, who was watching her closely, his expression still guarded. "Jerome," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "I am so sorry. I judged you unfairly, and I caused you pain that you didn't deserve. I hope you can forgive me, but I understand if you can't." The room was deathly quiet as Marge's words hung in the air. For a long moment, no one spoke. Jerome's eyes softened as he stood, walking slowly toward the podium. The crowd watched in silence, their anticipation palpable. When he reached the podium, Jerome turned to face Marge. His voice was calm, but there was a weight to his words. "Thank you for your apology, Marge," he said quietly. "It means a lot that you're standing up here and taking responsibility for what happened." Marge swallowed hard, nodding, unsure of what to say next. But Jerome wasn't finished. "I want you to know," he continued, "that this isn't just about what happened between us. It's about something much bigger. What you did, the fear you acted on, it's something that's been ingrained in our society for a long time. And it's not just you. It's something we all have to confront, in ourselves and in each other." Jerome paused, his voice growing stronger. "But that's the thing. We can confront it. We can choose to do better, to see each other for who we really are, instead of through the lens of fear and prejudice. It's not easy, but it's possible. And I think this town has the potential to change if we all work at it." Marge felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them back, nodding slowly. "Thank you, Jerome," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jerome gave a small nod of acknowledgement before turning back to the crowd. "This is just the beginning," he said, addressing the room. "We have a lot of work to do, but we can get there, together, and I'm ready to do my part as your new mayor." The room erupted into applause, louder this time, filled with a sense of hope and possibility. People stood, clapping, some cheering, as the weight of the past few days seemed to lift, if only slightly. It was a small step, but it felt like the first step toward something bigger. A community willing to face its flaws and work toward healing. After the meeting ended, people began to file out of the auditorium, still talking about Jerome's powerful words and the significance of Marge's public apology. Many approached Jerome, shaking his hand, offering words of support and encouragement. He smiled and thanked them, but his mind was already racing ahead, thinking of the work that lay before him. Marge, meanwhile, lingered at the back of the room, watching from a distance as people surrounded Jerome. She felt a mix of relief and uncertainty. She had done what she could to make amends, but she knew that forgiveness wasn't something that could be rushed. It would take time, for Jerome, for the community, and for herself. As the crowd began to thin, Jerome finally caught her eye. He excused himself from the group and made his way toward her, his expression warm but serious. "I meant what I said up there," Jerome said, his voice low. "We all have a lot to learn, but I appreciate that you're willing to start." Marge nodded, her throat tight with emotion. I just want to be better," she said softly. "I know I've got a lot of work to do." Jerome smiled, a genuine, kind smile that put her at ease. "We all do," he said, "but you're on the right path." Marge felt a wave of relief wash over her, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to smile. She wasn't sure what would come next, but she knew that this moment was the beginning of something different, for her, for Jerome, and for the entire community. As they walked out of the auditorium side by side, the weight of the past few days lifted slightly, replaced by a shared sense of purpose. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, it felt like the town was ready to face it, together.